100 miles of open air. That is all that separates a patch of pine trees in the Dutch forest from the crowded streets of London. Millions of civilians are waking up, listening for the familiar drone of bombers. They are confident in their shield, the massive radar nets and the brave pilots of the Royal Air Force. They believe the sky is a barrier that can be patrolled, guarded, and defended. But they are about to face a weapon that has no sound, a weapon that moves through the vacuum of space before falling like a silent hammer from the heavens. An engineer named Dieter stands in a concrete bunker 500 meters away from the launch pad. He isn't a soldier, he is a mathematician of death, a man who speaks in trajectories and fuel-to-oxygen ratios. He watches the pressure gauges with a cold, analytical intensity. In previous eras of warfare, victory was measured in the grit of the infantry, the sweat of the brow, and the strength of a sword arm. Here, in the damp mist of 1944, it is measured in liquid oxygen, graphite veins, and atmospheric pressure. What happens in the next few minutes will change the definition of warfare forever. These secret weapons weren't just bigger guns or faster planes. They were systems of transcendence designed to bypass human reaction, scramble the senses, and vaporize the target before the brain can even register a threat. The command is given, Zündung. A spark ignites the preburner, and in a heartbeat, the V-2 rocket erupts with 25 tons of thrust. This is the shock. It doesn't fly like a traditional aircraft. It doesn't rely on lift or wings to stay aloft. It punches through the thick atmosphere at 5 times the speed of sound, screaming toward the edge of the world. By the time it reaches its apogee, 88 kilometers above the Earth, it has left the realm of human hearing. It enters the black silence of space. Because it travels at Mach 5, it is faster than the sound waves it creates. In London, there is no air raid siren. There is no warning buzz of an engine. The V-2 hits the ground before the sound of its arrival can even reach the street. It is the first weapon in history where the victim is dead before the noise of the impact is heard. This is shock on a psychological level that defies the instincts of survival. To be hunted by a ghost that strikes from the stars is a terror that breaks the will of a population. The V-2 was not merely a missile, it was an engineering masterpiece of liquid-fueled propulsion and automatic guidance. Inside its nose, 2 gyroscopes spin at 20,000 revolutions per minute, acting as an artificial brain that corrects the rocket's path mid-flight. If the wind pushes the hull, the gyros detect the shift and send electrical signals to graphite rudders sitting in the path of the exhaust, steering the flame itself to keep the weapon on its lethal course. While the V-2 attacked the physical world, another secret weapon protected the invisible one. The Enigma machine was the shield of the digital age long before the computer existed. Imagine a wooden box containing 3 rotating metal rotors, providing 158 quintillion possible combinations for every letter typed. This was the block. It was an invisible wall made of pure mathematics. To the soldiers in the field, it looked like a typewriter, but to the intelligence officers on the other side of the English Channel, it was a fortress they could not climb. The belief was that the code was unbreakable, a shield so perfect that even if the machine was captured, the logic remained hidden. This forced the opposition to invent the first electromechanical computers just to stand a chance of peering through the fog. It was a weapon of secrecy that allowed fleets to move in silence and armies to vanish from the map, protected by the armor of a mathematical cipher. When the block failed and the physical shock hit, the final kill was delivered by machines that transcended human limits. The Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. It didn't have a propeller, it didn't have the limits of a piston engine. It moved 120 miles per hour faster than any other aircraft in the sky. It used swept-wing technology, a radical secret of aerodynamics that reduced drag and allowed for high-speed stability. It is the same design that serves as the blueprint for every modern fighter jet and commercial airliner today. To the pilots flying against it, the Me-262 was a blur, a weapon that could engage and disengage at will, choosing the moment of the kill with mathematical certainty. On the ground, the same philosophy of systematic lethality birthed the STG-44. It wasn't a rifle and it wasn't a machine gun. It was the world's first assault rifle. It utilized an intermediate cartridge that allowed for the range of a long-distance rifle with the rapid-fire capability of a submachine gun. It turned the individual soldier into a high-speed suppression system, capable of dominating a battlefield with a volume of fire that traditional bolt-action rifles could not match. The mechanical superiority of these systems relied on a level of industrial standardization that had never been seen before. In the underground factories of central Germany, thousands worked in silence to assemble the thousands of individual parts required for a single V2. This was not the craftsmanship of the past. It was the birth of the modern military-industrial complex. Every bolt, every valve, and every circuit had to be identical, ensuring that the machine would behave exactly like the mathematical model Dieter studied in his bunker. This transition from the soldier as a hero to the soldier as a technician is the true secret of this era. The weapon was no longer an extension of the man was now a servant to the machine. As the war progressed, the desperation for a decisive blow led to even more radical designs. Engineers moved away from the practical and toward the theoretical, looking for ways to exploit the very laws of physics. They experimented with night vision scopes like the Vampire, which allowed infantry to see in total darkness using infrared light, effectively turning the night itself into a weapon. They designed massive, super-heavy tanks like the Maus, which were so heavy they could not cross traditional bridges, yet possessed enough armor to be virtually invulnerable to enemy fire. These projects were often failures in a practical sense, but they represented a shift in the philosophy of war, the belief that enough engineering power could overcome any strategic disadvantage. The tragedy of the Supreme Machine is that its most enduring legacy was built in the shadow of total destruction. Dieter, standing in his bunker, knew that the system he had helped create had forever ended the age of the traditional warrior. The future of war, and the future of the world, would now be written in the language of the machine. Beneath the surface of the Reich, the transition from mechanical innovation to psychological warfare began to take a darker, more complex turn. This is where the concept of the Supreme Machine evolved from a tool of conquest into a system of total control. This is the block and the invisible kill, the weapons that targeted the enemy's mind and information before they ever targeted their bodies. The Enigma machine was not merely a box of gears, it was a psychological fortress. To understand the depth of this block, one must look at the rotors themselves. Each rotor was a complex web of internal wiring that changed the electrical path of a letter with every single keystroke. If you pressed the letter A 5 times in a row, the machine would output 5 completely different letters. The number of possible configurations was so vast that even if an Allied intelligence officer possessed the machine and the daily codebooks, the sheer mathematical probability of decrypting a message in time to act on it was nearly zero. This was the first time in history that mathematics was used as a primary defensive armor. It allowed the U-boat wolf packs to coordinate in the vast, empty reaches of the Atlantic Ocean, striking at supply lines like a single multi-headed organism. The ocean was no longer a barrier to communication, it was a playground for a hidden, synchronized predator. But the Supreme Machine required more than just secret codes. It required the ability to see where others were blind. This leads us to the Vampire infrared system. While the rest of the world's infantries were limited by the rising and setting of the sun, engineers were perfecting the ZG-1229. It was a bulky, heavy apparatus mounted on the STG-44 assault rifle, consisting of a large infrared searchlight and a high-voltage battery pack carried on the soldier's back. To the naked eye, the forest remained pitch black. But through the Vampire scope, the world turned into a spectral green landscape. The shock here was the total removal of the safety of darkness. Allied soldiers, believing they were hidden by the night, were being targeted with lethal precision by snipers who were effectively looking through the veil of nature itself. It was the birth of 24-hour warfare, a concept that would become the standard for every elite special forces unit in the modern era. As we move deeper into the kill systems, we must examine the Krupp K5 railway gun, known as Leopold. This was the ultimate expression of the heavy artillery mindset. It was a cannon so massive it had to be transported on specialized railway tracks, capable of hurling a 550-pound shell over a distance of 40 miles. When Leopold fired, the atmospheric pressure in the immediate vicinity would drop so sharply it could burst the eardrums of anyone standing too close without protection. The shell didn't just hit a target, it deleted a coordinate. In the battles of Anzio, the sound of Leopold's shells was described by soldiers as the sound of a freight train screaming through the air. You couldn't run from it, you couldn't hide from it, and you couldn't counterfire against it because the gun was tucked away in a railway tunnel miles behind the front lines. It was a ghost of iron, a weapon that utilized the very infrastructure of the continent to deliver untraceable destruction. This obsession with scale eventually birthed the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, projects that pushed the limits of what steel and fuel could physically achieve. The Hortenho 229 is the most striking example of this. Long before the American B-2 Spirit was a blueprint, engineers had built a functional flying wing. It had no tail, no fuselage in the traditional sense, and was coated in a special mixture of charcoal and glue designed to absorb radar waves. It was the world's first stealth fighter. The Ho 229 was designed to fly so fast and so low that by the time a radar operator saw a blip on his screen, the aircraft would have already dropped its payload and disappeared back into the clouds. It was the physical manifestation of the engineering philosophy. If you can transcend the enemy's ability to perceive you, you have already won the battle. However, the Supreme machine was beginning to strain under its own complexity. Every new jet engine required rare metals like chromium and cobalt that could no longer be secured. Every V-2 rocket consumed the caloric equivalent of 30,000 tons of potatoes for its alcohol-based fuel that was desperately needed to feed a crumbling nation. This is the great paradox. As the weapons became more supreme, they became more disconnected from the reality of the war. The engineers were no longer building tools to win a conflict. They were building monuments to their own technical genius. They were obsessed with the how and had completely forgotten the why. The final block of this era wasn't a machine at all, but the atmospheric defenses of the flak towers. These were massive, self-contained concrete fortresses rising hundreds of feet above cities like Berlin and Vienna. They were so thick that Allied bombs simply bounced off their sides. Each tower was equipped with radar-directed 12.8-centimeter guns that could fire in perfect synchronization, creating a literal ceiling of lead over the city. A pilot flying into this zone wasn't just facing a gun. He was flying into a calculated grid of explosions designed by mathematicians to ensure that no matter which way he turned, he would intersect with a piece of shrapnel. It was the ultimate block, a physical barrier that turned the sky itself into a solid wall of fire. As the industrial heart of the continent was squeezed, the kill systems moved toward the X-series of wire-guided missiles. The Ruhrstahl X-4 was the world's first air-to-air missile. A pilot would fire it from his fighter, and then, using a small joystick in his cockpit, he would literally steer the missile via thin copper wires into the formation of enemy bombers. It removed the need for dogfighting. It turned the deadly ballet of aerial combat into a remote-controlled execution. The pilot was no longer a knight of the air, he was an operator, a precursor to the drone pilots of the 21st century. This was the peak of the Supreme Machine's influence, the moment where human bravery was officially replaced by technical precision. The shock was no longer the sight of a charging army, but the realization that the enemy didn't even need to be in the same zip code to kill you. The block was no longer a shield of wood and leather, but a shield of invisible frequencies and mathematical barriers, and the kill was no longer a thrust of a blade, but the intersection of a sensor and a target. The final evolution of this era was the shift from mechanical advantage to total eradication, the attempt to end the possibility of resistance through sheer technological terror. This was the age of the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2's cheaper, louder, and more psychological cousin. If the V-2 was the silent hammer from space, the V-1 was the doodlebug, the pulse jet that screamed across the sky with a rhythmic mechanical stutter. This was a weapon of systematic exhaustion. The pulse jet engine was engineered to run until a mechanical timer cut the fuel, causing the engine to sputter and die. In London, that silence became the most terrifying sound in the world. It meant the block had failed and the kill was descending. It was a weapon of mass anxiety, forcing an entire population to live in a constant state of auditory monitoring. It proved that a weapon didn't need to be precise if it could be psychologically omnipresent. But while the pulse jets targeted the spirit of the civilian, the Schwerer Gustav targeted the physical foundations of the Earth itself. This was the largest rifled weapon ever built, a 1,350-ton railway gun with a barrel 100 feet long. It fired 7-ton shells, each the size of a full-grown elephant, capable of penetrating 30 feet of reinforced concrete or 5 feet of solid steel. During the siege of Sevastopol, the Gustav fired a shell that traveled 30 kilometers and struck an undersea ammunition magazine protected by nearly 100 feet of natural rock and water. The resulting explosion was so massive it created a localized earthquake. This was the eradication system at its peak. It wasn't about maneuver or strategy. It was about the absolute removal of a target from the physical plane. It was the ultimate expression of power that turned geography into a liability. As the ground war closed in, the obsession with the Supreme Machine led to the development of guided gravity. This was the Fritz X, the world's first smart bomb. It was a 3,000-pound armor-piercing explosive equipped with 4 small wings and a radio-controlled tail. A bombardier sitting in a plane thousands of feet above the target would watch the bomb fall and, using a joystick, would steer the weapon with a radio signal. In 1943, a single Fritz X struck the battleship Roma, slicing through 7 decks of steel and detonating in the engine room, sinking one of the most powerful ships in the Mediterranean in minutes. This was the moment the big gun era died. The secret was no longer the size of the shell, but the intelligence of the guidance system. It was the shock of realization for every navy on Earth. A single aircraft carrying a single Supreme Machine could destroy a billion-dollar fleet without ever coming within range of its guns. In the final months, the engineering turned toward the ethereal kill, the use of sound and light as weapons. Experiments with the sonic cannon involved 2 parabolic reflectors designed to focus the sound of methane and oxygen explosions into a beam. The goal was to create a focused vibration so intense it could shatter the internal organs of a human being from 50 yards away. While it never saw combat, it represented the final evolution of the mindset, the desire to turn the very vibrations of the air into a system of death. They were no longer looking for better steel. They were looking for a way to weaponize the laws of physics. This leads to the final, most ambitious theory of the era, the sun gun. Scientists began theorizing a 100-meter-wide orbital mirror made of metallic sodium. This mirror, positioned in geostationary orbit, would focus the sun's rays into a single concentrated beam of heat capable of vaporizing a city or boiling an ocean. It was the ultimate transcendence. It was the machine removed from the Earth entirely, a weapon that utilized the power of the solar system itself to enforce total dominance. It was the logical conclusion of a system that believed there was no problem that could not be solved by more engineering, more scale, and more power. But as the factories were overrun and the fuel ran dry, the Supreme Machine faced the reality of the human factor. No matter how fast a jet could fly, it had no fuel to take off. No matter how unbreakable a code was, it couldn't stop an infantryman from kicking down the door of the Radio Shack. The secret weapons were brilliant in their math, but catastrophic in their logistics. They were built for a war of the future, while the war of the present was being won by the side that could produce the most good-enough equipment at the highest volume. The legacy of the Supreme Machine is the world we inhabit today. Every time you see a rocket launch into space, you are seeing the direct descendant of the V2. Every time you use a computer, you are utilizing technology birthed from the need to break the Enigma. Every time you fly in a jet, you are using the swept-wing aerodynamics of the Me-2 6-2. These secret weapons did not win the war, but they provided the blueprint for the modern world. They moved humanity from the age of the warrior to the age of the operator. They taught us that the ultimate weapon isn't a sword or a shield, but the systematic application of technical genius to the problem of destruction. Dieter stands in his bunker one last time as the sounds of artillery, not his own but the enemy's, draw closer. He looks at his pressure gauges and his trajectories, and he realizes that the Supreme Machine has a flaw. It is a machine designed to conquer the world, but it forgot that the world is made of people, not just numbers. The rocket rises, the jet screams, and the code turns, but the silence of the forest is finally broken by the sound of the end. The era of the Supreme Machine is over, but the age of the machine has just begun.